A man had just bought a digital camera. He wanted to test it, so he walked outside and took a few random photographs. A field, some trees, a quiet road in rural Sweden. He didn't think much of it. He went inside and forgot about those pictures for days. Those photographs would solve a murder. The village of Stjärnsund sits in Dalarna County, a region that most Swedes will tell you represents everything safe and quiet about their country. Forests, lakes, small houses, neighbours who know your name. It is the kind of place where children cycle home alone, where parents don't worry, where nothing bad is supposed to happen. On the afternoon of April 5th, 2008, 10-year-old Engla Juncosa Höglund was cycling home. She had spent the day the way any child that age spends a Saturday, playing football with friends, being outside, enjoying the first real weeks of spring. She was 10 years old. She was 3 minutes from home. What we know about Engla, from those who loved her, is that she was the kind of child who filled a room. Energetic, stubborn in the best way. She played football, she laughed loudly, and she had no reason whatsoever, to be afraid of that road home. She had cycled it 100 times. She never arrived. When Engla didn't come home, her family assumed she'd stayed longer at her friend's. Children do that. You don't panic immediately. You wait. You check the clock. You tell yourself there's an explanation. But as the afternoon became evening, that quiet, familiar dread began to set in. By nightfall, it was clear. Something was wrong. Police were called, and within hours the search had grown into something Sweden had rarely seen. Volunteers, civil defence units, military home guard, hundreds of people moving through the forests around Stjärnsund with flashlights and maps. The whole country was watching. Swedish television covered the search in near real time. People across the country held their breath, checking the news, hoping. Because at that point, hope was still possible. Then they found Engla's bicycle, in the forest, just a few hundred meters from her front door. Discarded, not fallen, thrown aside, as if in a hurry. That detail alone shifted everything. This was no longer a missing child. This was a crime scene. Investigators worked urgently, but they had almost nothing to go on. A rural road, no witnesses, no surveillance cameras in a village like Stjärnsund. Days passed, and then something happened that no investigator could have planned for. A local man had recently bought a digital camera. On April 5th, the same afternoon Engla disappeared, he had taken it outside to test it. Random photographs. A quiet road. When investigators reviewed those images, they found two things. Engla, cycling down the road, and behind her, a red Saab. One photograph, one vehicle, one license plate. The car was traced to a 35-year-old truck driver named Anders Eklund. Eklund was arrested within days. Under questioning, he confessed. He then led investigators to where Engla's body had been left in the forest. The case, on the surface, appeared solved. But Swedish investigators were about to discover something that would change the meaning of this entire case. Anders Eklund had lived an ordinary life. That is what made it so difficult to understand. He was 35 years old, a truck driver. He had a job, a routine, a life that moved quietly through the same roads and towns of Dalarna that thousands of other people moved through every single day. He was not a man who stood out. He was not a man who raised alarms. He was not a man that neighbours pointed to and said, "There is something wrong with him." He was, by all outward appearances, unremarkable, and that is the most chilling thing about what came next. Because Anders Eklund had a history. Not a history that was obvious, not a history that announced itself, but a history that existed in police files, in unread documents, in tips that had come in and gone nowhere. We will come back to that, but first, you need to understand what investigators found when they looked closer at the man behind the wheel of that red Saab. When forensic teams ran Anders Eklund's DNA through the national database, they got a match they were not expecting. A 31-year-old woman named Pernilla Hellgren had been murdered in Falun in the year 2000. Her case had remained unsolved for 8 years. The DNA was identical. Anders Eklund had killed before. 8 years before Engla disappeared, he had already taken a life, and no one had stopped him. Let that sit for a moment. 8 years. Pernilla Hellgren was 31 years old when she was murdered. She lived in Falun, a city in the same county as Stjärnsund. She had a life, people who loved her, a future that was taken from her in the year 2000. Her case went cold. Investigators worked it, followed leads, and eventually, the trail went quiet. For 8 years, Pernilla's family waited for an answer. They got one, but not in the way anyone would have wanted. Now, here is where this case stops being a tragedy and becomes something else entirely, because after Eklund's arrest, investigators began going back through the files. They went back through the tips that had come in during earlier investigations. And what they found was that Anders Eklund's name had appeared before. Not once, not buried in a single obscure report. His name had come in as a tip, connected to earlier criminal investigations, years before Engla ever got on her bicycle that Saturday afternoon. Those tips had not been properly followed up, not acted on, not pursued with the urgency they deserved. A name, in a police file, unactioned. When this came to light after Eklund's arrest, Sweden did not take it quietly. The debate that followed was fierce and painful and necessary. How had this happened? How does a name appear in a police file connected to violent crime and simply remain there, unread, unfollowed, forgotten? The answers pointed to several failures happening at the same time. Resource shortages in Swedish regional police, a system where tips were logged but not always cross-referenced, a structure where information sat in one department without reaching another. Not malice, not corruption. Something in some ways more frightening. Bureaucracy, overwhelm. A system that was not built to connect the dots it needed to connect. And somewhere inside that system, a name sat waiting. While Pernilla Hellgren's case went cold, while years passed, while a 10-year-old girl in Stjärnsund cycled home on a spring afternoon. The question that Sweden asked after Eklund's conviction, and that has never fully been answered, is this: if those tips had been followed up properly, if that name had been investigated the way it should have been, would Anders Eklund have been stopped before April 5th, 2008? Would Pernilla Hellgren's family have received justice years earlier? Would Engla Juncosa Höglund still be alive? We cannot know for certain, but the weight of the evidence suggests that the answer might be yes. In 2008, Anders Eklund was convicted of 2 murders, Engla Juncosa Höglund and Pernilla Hellgren. He was also convicted of rape and child pornography offences. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Engla's funeral was broadcast on Swedish national television. That almost never happens. It tells you everything about how deeply this case reached into the country's sense of safety and loss. What followed in the years after the verdict was a long, painful national conversation about police resources, about how tips are logged and shared and prioritized, about the gap between what investigators have and what they actually use. Reforms were introduced in Swedish law enforcement. Changes were made to how information is handled across departments, how tips are tracked, how names are cross-referenced between investigations. Those reforms came too late for Pernilla. Too late for Engla, too late for their families. But they came. And they came because Sweden refused to simply accept what had happened and move on. That matters, even if it can never be enough. What I keep returning to, and what I want to leave with you, is that photograph. A man testing a camera he just bought. Random images on a spring afternoon. He had no idea at all, what he was capturing. A quiet road. A girl on a bicycle, a red car in the background. In a case with almost no physical evidence, that one accidental image placed a killer directly behind a child. It solved a murder that might otherwise never have been solved. And yet, that photograph should never have been necessary. The name was already there, in a file, in a system, waiting to be read. 2 women are dead who might not have been. And a question remains that Swedish law enforcement and Swedish society has had to live with ever since. What do we owe the victims of a system that failed them? And how do we make sure it never fails like that again? I want to hear what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because this is not a closed case. Not really. Not as long as these questions remain unanswered. Subscribe to the Dark Nordic. Because this case isn't over yet. Not until we understand how it was allowed to happen.